From which corner of America are you watching this story today? If you've ever been underestimated, judged, or dismissed, this story will remind you that sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths. Subscribe now, because what happens next will leave you speechless. She sat motionless in the defendant's chair, the weight of her service medals creating sharp contrast against the suffocating heaviness that filled the Norfolk military courtroom. Former Navy SEAL Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell faced her accusers without a tremor in her steady gaze, her perfectly pressed dress blue uniform bearing ribbons that told stories of courage most people would never comprehend. The judge's voice cut through the sterile air like a blade, dripping with contempt as he stared down at her from his elevated bench, his weathered face twisted into an expression of disdain that seemed reserved specifically for moments like this. "You're not special, Commander Mitchell. You're nothing more than weak," he declared, his words echoing off the polished wood paneling and brass fixtures that failed to provide any warmth to the proceedings unfolding within these walls. What happened next silenced the entire courtroom in a way that would haunt everyone present for years to come. The Naval Station Norfolk military courtroom possessed an unsettling sterility that morning, its traditional wood paneling and meticulously polished brass fixtures creating an atmosphere of rigid formality that somehow managed to drain all humanity from the space where justice was supposedly being served. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell maintained perfect military posture in her immaculate dress blues, the constellation of ribbons and medals across her chest, telling a story of 15 years of exemplary service, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and commendations that most officers could only dream of earning. Her hands rested calmly on the polished mahogany table before her, her right thumb occasionally tracing the jagged scar that ran across her left palm, a private ritual unnoticed by anyone else in the room. A small gesture that connected her to memories of operations that officially never happened. The court-martial proceedings had been grinding forward for 2 grueling days already, each hour adding another layer of tension to an atmosphere that was becoming increasingly hostile toward the decorated officer, who sat accused of the unthinkable crime of refusing a direct order during Operation Nightfall, a classified extraction mission in a location that remained officially undisclosed even in these proceedings. The prosecution's evidence played endlessly across multiple screens mounted throughout the chamber, satellite footage showing the mission unfolding in stark black and white precision, thermal signatures moving through a compound like ghosts in the digital darkness, communication chatter, providing clinical narration to what would become Sarah Mitchell's defining moment as a military officer. The operation, a covert extraction designed to retrieve high-value intelligence from a location deep behind enemy lines, had gone catastrophically sideways when Mitchell made the split-second decision to refuse a direct order to proceed despite intelligence reports suggesting significant civilian presence in the target zone, a decision that would ultimately save innocent lives but cost her everything she had worked to achieve. Colonel Marcus Stone stood at the center of the courtroom like a predator circling wounded prey, his career military bearing evident in every calculated gesture, his salt and pepper hair perfectly groomed and his dress uniform displaying nearly as many decorations as Mitchell's, though his medals had been earned primarily behind conference room tables rather than in the chaos of actual combat zones where life and death decisions had to be made in microseconds. He gestured sharply to the technician who controlled the damning radio transmissions that formed the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against the decorated SEAL commander. The speakers crackled to life with the sound of her final operational communication, words that would define her legacy in ways she never could have imagined when she spoke them into her headset that night months ago in a hostile foreign land where American forces officially did not exist. Shadow Base. This is Phoenix Leader. You are cleared to execute primary objective. Confirm ready status, came the authoritative voice of command through the static-filled transmission. Mitchell's response followed immediately, her voice steady despite the life-altering consequences she knew her words would trigger. Shadow Base. Phoenix leader cannot comply with current operational parameters, requesting immediate mission abort based on updated civilian intelligence. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across time itself before command responded with barely controlled fury. Phoenix leader, that is a direct order from the highest levels of command. Execute immediately or face immediate court-martial upon return to base. Sarah's final transmission would become the moment that ended her career and saved lives that would never know her name. Shadow base. With respect, some lines should never be crossed regardless of who gives the order to cross them. The assembled officers and officials throughout the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats as these words echoed through the courtroom. A ripple of unease moving through the crowd like a wave disturbing the surface of still water. In the front row, Admiral James Crawford sat with his weathered face maintaining a carefully practiced mask of neutrality that seemed strangely out of place for what should have been a straightforward disciplinary hearing. His steel-gray eyes, however, never left Mitchell's face, studying her with an intensity that suggested deeper currents flowing beneath the surface of these proceedings than anyone in the room fully understood. Major Lisa Rodriguez, Mitchell's defense counsel, rose from her seat with fluid precision, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and her uniform pressed to absolute perfection. The defense maintains that Commander Mitchell acted within her authority as team leader when faced with actionable intelligence regarding civilian casualties that would have resulted from executing the mission as originally planned. The rules of engagement clearly state that operational commanders have both the authority and the responsibility to modify mission parameters when civilian lives are at immediate risk. Colonel Stone interrupted with the practiced ease of a prosecutor who had destroyed military careers for decades. The rules of engagement do not supersede direct orders from operational command during active classified missions. Your Honor, Commander Mitchell's refusal to follow explicit orders represents a fundamental breakdown of military discipline that strikes at the very heart of command structure. Judge Advocate General Robert Hayes looked down from his position on the bench with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of countless similar proceedings. His voice carried the certainty of someone who had spent decades being the final authority in courtrooms exactly like this one. The court will focus solely on Commander Mitchell's failure to obey lawful orders on the night in question. Her previous operational history, while noted, does not excuse insubordination during active combat operations. Rodriguez pressed forward despite the hostile atmosphere that was building around her client like storm clouds gathering before a hurricane. Your Honor, we respectfully request access to Commander Mitchell's complete service record, including her classified deployments with specialized units. The context of her decision-making process can only be fully understood when viewed through the lens of her extensive operational experience in similar high-risk scenarios. Judge Hayes' expression remained unchanged as he delivered his response with bureaucratic finality. Request. Commander Mitchell's previous deployments under classified parameters are not relevant to her refusal to obey direct orders. This court will examine only the facts of Operation Nightfall and her actions on that specific date. Mitchell's expression remained perfectly controlled, though something flickered deep in her blue eyes as she watched this exchange, a momentary flash of recognition that suggested she understood exactly what was happening and why certain aspects of her service record were being kept sealed. From her position at the defendant's table, she noticed a young woman in civilian clothing taking detailed notes in the back row of the gallery. When their eyes met briefly across the crowded courtroom, there was a spark of recognition, though Mitchell couldn't immediately place where she might have encountered this intense young woman who seemed to be documenting every word of the proceedings with unusual thoroughness. The first day's proceedings concluded with testimony from Mitchell's immediate commanding officer, who described her as exceptional in most respects, but noted what he characterized as a troubling pattern of questioning operational orders in recent months, a pattern that the prosecution would eventually use to paint a picture of an officer who had lost respect for the chain of command that held military structure together. As the courtroom began to empty, Mitchell observed Admiral Crawford exchanging urgent words with a civilian she didn't recognize before both men disappeared through a side door rather than using the main entrance like everyone else. a small detail that she filed away in the back of her mind for future reference. Rodriguez gathered her papers with movements that betrayed the frustration she was working hard to contain. They're systematically cutting off every avenue of defense, Command. Without access to your complete service record, it's going to be extremely difficult to establish proper context for your decision during Operation Nightfall. The context wouldn't change the outcome anyway, Mitchell replied quietly, her voice carrying undertones of resignation mixed with something that might have been determination. Some aspects of military service don't appear in official records regardless of classification level. Rodriguez studied her client with the careful attention of a defense attorney who sensed there were layers to this case that she wasn't being allowed to explore. Would you care to elaborate on that statement, Commander? Mitchell stirred and adjusted her uniform with mechanical precision. Some ghosts from the past should remain buried, Major. At least for now. The second day of proceedings followed much the same pattern as the first, with technical experts providing detailed testimony about operational parameters and intelligence assessments that preceded the doomed mission. Mitchell listened attentively to even the most damaging testimony, her expression never changing even when presented with evidence that seemed to support the prosecution's narrative of an officer who had lost the mental fortitude necessary for Special Operations Command. Only when a junior intelligence analyst mentioned the possibility of civilian casualties did she lean forward slightly, her attention focusing with laser intensity on the nervous young man who admitted under cross-examination that warnings about potential non-combatant presence had indeed been included in the pre-mission briefing materials distributed to operational commanders. By the third day, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically from professional detachment to something approaching hostility directed specifically toward the decorated SEAL commander. Word had spread through the tight-knit officer community about the nature of the proceeding, and several new faces appeared in the gallery. Senior officers whose very presence seemed designed to send a clear message about the consequences of refusing direct orders, regardless of the circumstances or potential collateral damage. Judge Hayes began the morning session by addressing the various motions that had been submitted overnight by both sides in this increasingly contentious case. The defense's request to call character witnesses from Commander Mitchell's previous operational assignments has been denied due to operational security concerns that supersede this court's jurisdiction. Additionally, this court will accept into evidence the psychological evaluation conducted by Navy Medical Command as part of these proceedings. Rodriguez was on her feet immediately, her controlled professional demeanor beginning to show cracks under the pressure of having every defensive strategy systematically dismantled. Your Honor, that psychological evaluation was conducted without proper notification to defense counsel, and its findings directly contradict Commander Mitchell's regular psychiatric assessments conducted throughout her 15-year career. The evaluation was ordered as a standard part of these proceedings and therefore falls within the court's authority to admit as evidence, Judge Hayes stated with the finality of someone who had made up his mind before the argument even began. Colonel Stone, you may proceed with your case. Stone approached the bench carrying a manila folder that he handled like a weapon being prepared for use. The prosecution calls Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell to the witness stand. Mitchell rose from her seat with the fluid grace that marked her as someone who had spent years moving through hostile territory, took the oath with steady eye contact that never wavered, and settled into the witness chair with the same perfect posture she had maintained throughout the entire proceeding. If she felt any concern about facing direct examination from a prosecutor who had built his career on destroying military officers, her demeanor gave no indication of weakness or fear. Stone began his questioning with standard inquiries about her training, deployment history and command experience, his approach methodical and calculated, establishing her credentials as an expert before beginning the systematic process of undermining those very qualifications. When he shifted his focus to Operation Nightfall, his tone hardened perceptibly and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop several degrees. Commander Mitchell, would you characterize yourself as someone who handles pressure well? I would characterize myself as someone who makes appropriate decisions under pressure, she responded evenly. Her voice carried no trace of defensiveness despite the obvious trap being set for her. Stone paced slowly in front of the witness stand like a predator who had cornered his prey. Yet Captain Warren's psychological evaluation suggests that you suffer from what he terms decision paralysis when faced with high-stakes operational choices. Would you say that assessment is accurate? I would say that assessment is incomplete and based on limited information, Mitchell replied without hesitation. Stone continued his methodical attack on her credibility and competence. Your team was specifically selected for Operation Nightfall because of the complexity and extreme risk factors involved. Did you feel overwhelmed by the responsibility placed on your shoulders? My team was fully prepared for the operational parameters as initially briefed, she answered calmly. Then please explain to this court why, when given explicit orders to proceed with the mission, you suddenly decided that you possessed superior judgment to your entire chain of command. The operational environment changed significantly from the initial briefing parameters, Mitchell responded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through situations that most people could never imagine. Updated intelligence indicated civilian presence in the target structure. Proceeding would have violated both rules of engagement and international law regarding the protection of non-combatants. Stone moved closer to the witness stand, his voice taking on a deliberately provocative tone designed to elicit an emotional response. Commander Mitchell, would you say that your gender made you hesitate when the lives of American servicemen were potentially at stake? The courtroom fell into absolute silence, as every person present processed the implications of the question that had just been asked. Several officers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, and Rodriguez was instantly on her feet with an objection that carried both legal authority and righteous anger. Objection, Your Honor. That question is inappropriate, irrelevant, and constitutes blatant gender discrimination. To everyone's surprise, Judge Hayes overruled the objection with a wave of his hand. The question goes to the defendant's decision-making process, which is central to these proceedings. The witness will answer. Mitchell's expression remained completely controlled, though something dangerous flickered behind her eyes as she processed both the question and the court's willingness to allow it. My decision-making process has kept operational teams alive through deployments across 3 different theaters of combat, Colonel Stone. My gender has never been a factor in my operational effectiveness, and it played no role in my assessment of the situation that night. Stone pressed his advantage with the ruthlessness of someone who sensed weakness, and yet when decisive action was required, when American lives hung in the balance, you froze. I made a tactical decision based on updated intelligence that prevented civilian casualties, she replied firmly. That represents leadership, not paralysis. The questioning continued for nearly 3 hours, growing increasingly personal and pointed with each exchange. When Mitchell attempted to reference a previous operation designated Crimson Shadow as precedent for her decision-making process during similar scenarios, Judge Hayes immediately cut her off with obvious irritation. That operation is classified beyond the scope of this court-martial and will not be discussed in these proceedings. With respect, Your Honor, Mitchell countered, the tactical similarities between Crimson Shadow and Operation Nightfall directly informed my assessment of the civilian casualty risks we faced that night. The court has ruled. Commander, Hayes said with barely concealed anger. Colonel Stone, move on to your next line of questioning immediately. As the day's proceedings neared their conclusion, Stone circled back to the psychological evaluation that had been introduced earlier. Commander Mitchell, if not decision paralysis, how would you characterize your refusal to follow explicit orders from operational command? Moral courage, she replied without a moment's hesitation. Stone repeated her words with obvious skepticism designed to highlight what he wanted the court to see as arrogance. Moral courage, above strategic objectives, above operational security, above the explicit orders of your superiors who possessed intelligence that you were not privy to. Some principles cannot be compromised, Colonel, regardless of who issues orders that would violate them. As Mitchell stepped down from the witness stand, Judge Hayes addressed her directly, his expression one of barely concealed contempt that had been building throughout the entire proceeding.
This court has seen nothing to suggest that you possess any special qualities, Commander Mitchell. You are not exceptional. You are weak, a liability to the brave men and women who serve alongside you and depend on clear command structures to keep them alive. The gallery watched in uncomfortable silence as these words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was consuming everything it touched. In the back row, a Pentagon official Mitchell hadn't noticed before spoke urgently into a secure phone while keeping his eyes fixed on the dramatic scene unfolding before him. As she returned to her seat beside Rodriguez, Mitchell noticed something she hadn't seen before. On Judge Hayes's desk, partially concealed beneath case files and legal documents, sat a manila folder marked with classification levels, so high that most military personnel would never know they existed. More importantly, the folder bore an insignia, embossed in one corner, a symbol she hadn't seen in years, one that shouldn't have been present in this courtroom under any circumstance. For the first time since the court-martial proceedings began, Sarah Mitchell felt something shift inside her, something that had been dormant since her last classified deployment ended in ways that were never officially acknowledged. As recognition dawned across her features, she straightened her shoulders and met Judge Hayes's gaze with a directness that seemed to surprise him. The judge's expression flickered momentarily, uncertainty replacing the condescension that had dominated his demeanor as he sensed that the dynamic between them had somehow fundamentally changed in ways he didn't understand. Court is adjourned until 0900 tomorrow morning, Hayes announced with uncharacteristic haste, gathering his materials with movements that betrayed nervousness for the first time during the proceedings, at which time this tribunal will render its final verdict. As the courtroom began to empty, Rodriguez leaned close to her client with obvious concern. "What just happened, Commander? You look like you've just seen a ghost from your past." Mitchell watched Judge Hayes exit through his private door, clutching the classified folder tightly against his chest as if protecting its contents from observation. "Not yet," she replied quietly, her voice carrying undertones that her defense counsel had never heard before. "But tomorrow morning, everyone in this courtroom will understand exactly who they've been trying to bury." Dawn broke over Naval Station Norfolk with unusual clarity, as if the universe itself was preparing for revelations that would change everything about the narrative that had been carefully constructed around Sarah Mitchell's court-martial. By 0800, the corridor outside the courtroom had filled with officers and officials who hadn't been present during previous days of testimony. Whispered conversations filled the space, discussions that fell silent whenever Mitchell or her counsel approached, creating an atmosphere of anticipation mixed with apprehension. Mitchell had arrived at the base earlier than required, wearing her dress blues with the same meticulous attention to detail that had defined her entire military career. She sat alone in the same side chamber where she had spent the previous 3 days, reviewing her service record one final time. The official version anyway, the sanitized document that omitted years of her career under the innocuous classification of special assignment. Rodriguez entered carrying her briefcase, and an expression of deep concern that had been growing since the previous day's strange conclusion. "Commander, something unprecedented is happening here." Admiral Catherine Wells arrived an hour ago with her entire senior staff. "The Chief of Naval Operations has sent a personal representative. There's someone here from the Secretary of Defense's office, and I've spotted at least 3 people who look like they work for agencies that officially don't exist." Mitchell looked up from her papers, her expression revealing nothing about her internal state. "Are you surprised by any of this, Major?" "Should I be?" Rodriguez asked, studying her client with the intensity of someone who sensed that major revelations were imminent. "You've known something I haven't throughout this entire process." "Many things," Mitchell confirmed, closing the folder containing her official service record. "After today's session concludes, Judge Hayes will understand exactly how much he didn't know." When they entered the courtroom at precisely 085 feed 5, the transformation from the previous day was immediately apparent and unsettling. The gallery had filled completely with senior officers, intelligence officials, and civilians whose bearing identified them as individuals who operated far beyond the normal boundaries of military justice. Admiral Crawford remained in his front row position, but now he was accompanied by 2 serious-looking men in dark suits, whose eyes continuously surveyed the room with the practiced vigilance of professional security personnel. Most significantly, the young woman Mitchell had noticed taking notes throughout the proceedings now sat directly behind the prosecution table, her attention focused on Mitchell with an intensity that seemed to transcend casual professional interest. At exactly 0900, Judge Hayes entered the courtroom, and immediately sensed that something fundamental had changed overnight. The expanded audience included flag officers whose very presence suggested that the stakes of these proceedings extended far beyond the court-martial of a single SEAL commander regardless of her decorations or previous service record. "This court-martial is now in session," he announced, taking his position behind the bench with movements that seemed less confident than during previous sessions. "Having reviewed all testimony and evidence presented, this court is prepared to render final judgment in the matter of the United States Navy versus Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, on charges of insubordination, dereliction of duty, and conduct unbecoming an officer." Hayes organized the papers before him, while glancing occasionally at the high-ranking officials who had gathered to witness his verdict. "Military justice provides defendants the opportunity to make final statements before sentence is pronounced. Commander Mitchell, do you wish to address this court before judgment is rendered?" Rodriguez placed a gentle hand on her client's arm. A silent question about whether this was the right time to speak, but Mitchell had already made her decision based on information that had been hidden from everyone present until this moment. She rose from her chair, adjusted her uniform jacket with mechanical precision, and moved toward the center of the courtroom with a bearing that seemed somehow different from the previous 3 days. "Your Honor, I formally request permission to properly identify myself for the complete record of these proceedings." Hayes frowned with obvious irritation at what seemed like a delay tactic. "Your name, rank and service record are already established in the court record, Commander Mitchell." "Not all of it," she replied, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been present during any of her previous testimony. "With the court's permission, I'd like to provide complete identification."
Hayes gestured impatiently toward the microphone positioned before the bench, clearly expecting another futile attempt to introduce irrelevant information about her service history. Mitchell approached the microphone and stood silently for several seconds, her posture shifting in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood the difference between a military officer and something far more dangerous. She leaned toward the microphone and spoke 2 words that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their careers: Shadow Phoenix. The reaction throughout the courtroom was immediate and electric, like lightning striking in a space that had been charged with tension for days. A colonel in the 3rd row knocked over his water glass, the sound of breaking glass cutting through sudden silence that seemed to suck all oxygen from the room. The Pentagon aide Mitchell had been watching stood abruptly, her hand moving instinctively toward a communication device. Admiral Crawford's face went completely pale as 20 years of carefully maintained composure cracked instantly. Judge Hayes, clearly confused by the dramatic reaction rippling through his courtroom, struggled to maintain control over proceedings that were rapidly spiraling beyond his understanding. "What did you say, Commander?" Mitchell repeated the words, her voice stronger and carrying authority that seemed to fill every corner of the space. "Shadow Phoenix. November 2018 through September 20. Joint Special Operations Command. Deep reconnaissance and direct action operations in locations that remain classified at levels beyond this court's jurisdiction." The courtroom erupted into barely controlled chaos as the implications of her statement began to register with those who possessed sufficient clearance to understand what she had just revealed. Several officers were already on secure phones, speaking in coded phrases that confirmed the legitimacy of what they had just heard. Hayes banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order in a courtroom that had completely slipped beyond his authority to control. "This court will have order immediately," he insisted, his voice rising as he struggled to comprehend the situation developing around him. "Whatever classified operations you may claim to have participated in, are irrelevant to the charges before this tribunal. He was interrupted by a civilian in an expensive dark suit who approached the bench with confident strides that identified him as someone accustomed to having his authority recognized immediately. The man leaned close to Hayes and handed him a secure communication device while speaking in tones too low for anyone else to hear. Hayes's expression underwent a complete transformation as he listened to whoever was speaking on the other end of the line, confusion giving way to shock, then to something approaching panic as the full implications of the situation became clear to him. "This court will recess for exactly 1 hour," he announced, his voice noticeably unsteady for the first time during the entire proceedings. "All personnel present will remain within this facility until further notice." As Hayes hastily exited through his private door, the courtroom dissolved into carefully controlled pandemonium. Officers formed tight clusters throughout the gallery, speaking in voices too low to be overheard while glancing repeatedly toward Mitchell, who remained standing at the center of the room like the eye of a hurricane. The 2 security personnel who had accompanied Admiral Crawford moved smoothly to secure the room's exits, politely but firmly preventing curious base personnel from entering or leaving. Crawford himself approached Mitchell directly, abandoning all pretense of judicial neutrality. Instead of anger or indignation, there was something approaching reverence in his weathered eyes as he offered her a subtle nod that acknowledged both her service and the sacrifices she had made in roles that could never be officially recognized. "Commander Mitchell, it's been far too long since we last spoke. 3 years, 7 months, Admiral," she replied with precision that spoke to the importance those missing years held in her memory. "We were informed that you had been killed during your final deployment," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of genuine sorrow for losses that could never be publicly mourned. "Some days I was," she answered simply, then turned away as Rodriguez approached with bewilderment written clearly across her features. In the holding room where they waited during the extended recess, Mitchell stood at the window overlooking the base, watching the unusual level of activity that had erupted across the installation. Official vehicles moved between buildings with unusual urgency, and security personnel had appeared around the courthouse perimeter in numbers that suggested someone had elevated the threat level significantly. Rodriguez finally broke the silence that had stretched between them since the dramatic courtroom revelation. "You owe me a complete explanation, Commander. I cannot provide adequate legal representation if I don't understand the true nature of what's happening here." Mitchell turned from the window, studying her attorney with eyes that seemed to evaluate Rodriguez's security clearance and need to know. "What's your current clearance level, Major?" "TSSCI with additional compartmented access for special operations legal support," Rodriguez replied, using terminology that indicated she had defended personnel from highly classified units before. 3 years ago, I commanded a unit that never officially existed," Mitchell began, her voice taking on the tone of someone recounting events that had been buried so deeply that speaking them aloud felt like a violation of sacred trust. "We handled operations that were too sensitive for even Joint Special Operations Command acknowledgement. Shadow Phoenix was designated for missions that absolutely could not be traced back to American authority under any circumstance." Rodriguez processed this information while pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place around the strange proceedings that had consumed the last 3 days. "What happened to your unit?" Mitchell's expression hardened as she accessed memories that she had spent years trying to suppress. "Our final mission was compromised from the beginning. We were sent into a situation with intelligence that was deliberately falsified, against my explicit recommendations to abort. My entire team was killed in the ambush that resulted from that decision. I survived by pure chance and spent 8 months recovering from injuries that should have been fatal." She unconsciously touched her left side, where Rodriguez now realized a significant wound must have occurred during that classified disaster. "I was officially listed as killed in action, which provided convenient cover for the unit's deactivation. 6 months later,
I was quietly reassigned to my current SEAL designation with a service record that omitted those 3 years entire. Rodriguez leaned forward with growing understanding of the forces that had been working against her client from the beginning. And Judge Hayes, what's his connection to all of this? Hayes served as legal counsel to the oversight committee that authorized Shadow Phoenix operations, including our final mission. He personally reviewed and approved the intelligence package that sent my team into an ambush, despite red flags that should have triggered mission cancellation. Rodriguez sat back in her chair as the full scope of the situation became clear. He's been trying to bury you to protect himself from accountability for what happened to your team. Mitchell nodded grimly. Some secrets are worth killing careers to protect, but today he's going to learn that some ghosts refuse to stay buried. When court reconvened exactly 1 hour later, Judge Hayes was conspicuously absent from the bench. In his place sat Admiral Catherine Wells, a legendary figure in Navy intelligence circles whose presence sent an unmistakable message about the level of attention this case had attracted from the highest levels of military command. The gallery had been cleared of all but the most senior observers, and new faces occupied the prosecution table, military lawyers whose uniforms identified them as Judge Advocate General Corps personnel attached to Special Operations Command rather than standard court-martial prosecutor. This tribunal is now in session under the direct authority of the Secretary of the Navy, Admiral Wells announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that required no gavel to command absolute attention. Due to the emergence of previously classified information relevant to these proceedings, this court-martial is hereby dissolved and all charges against Lieutenant Commander Mitchell are dismissed effective, immediate. She descended from the bench in an unprecedented break from military judicial protocol and approached Mitchell directly, carrying a leather portfolio that bore classification markings, indicating its contents were among the most closely guarded secrets in the American military. Commander Mitchell, on behalf of the United States Navy and the American people, I extend our deepest apologies for the misunderstanding that led to these proceedings. Your service record has been amended to reflect the true nature of your actions during Operation Nightfall, which are now recognized as consistent with the highest traditions of military service, and your unique operational background. The carefully worded statement continued as Wells addressed the remaining audience without explicitly confirming classified details that would remain secret. Without violating operational security, this court acknowledges that Commander Mitchell's decision during Operation Nightfall was informed by experience gained during previous classified operations that remain highly classified. Her refusal to execute the mission as originally planned prevented civilian casualties and demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage that defines the best traditions of military leadership. Wells opened the leather portfolio and withdrew Mitchell's sidearm, which had been confiscated at the beginning of the court-martial proceedings. The ceremonial return of her weapon symbolized the complete restoration of her authority and standing as a military officer. Additionally, this court has received documentation indicating that former Judge Hayes had undisclosed conflicts of interest in this case, having been involved in the authorization process for previous operations that directly influenced Commander Mitchell's assessment of the tactical situation during Operation Nightfall. Hayes has submitted his resignation from military service effective immediately, and a full investigation into his conduct will be conducted by appropriate authority. Mitchell remained at attention throughout the formal vindication, her expression betraying nothing of the emotional weight that was lifting from her shoulders, as years of carried burden began to dissolve. Only those who had known her during her Shadow Phoenix years might have detected the slight relaxation in her posture that indicated the long nightmare was finally ending. As Admiral Wells concluded the proceedings, she addressed Mitchell one final time. You are hereby released from these proceedings with full honors, Commander. Report to my office at 800 tomorrow for discussion of your future assignments. The implications were clear to everyone present who possessed sufficient clearance to understand what was being offered. When the courtroom finally cleared, Rodriguez approached her former client with a mixture of professional admiration and personal curiosity. "What happens now, Commander?" Mitchell gathered her personal effects, slowly processing the transformation that had occurred not just in her legal status, but in her identity as a military officer. "That depends entirely on what Admiral Wells discussed with her superiors in Washington last night," she replied thoughtfully. "Some ghosts, once awakened, tend to find new purposes rather than returning to their grave." Through the courtroom windows, she could see Judge Hayes being escorted to a waiting vehicle by two naval security officers, his military career effectively ended by the truth he had spent years trying to suppress. The wheels of justice moved slowly in military circles, but they moved with inexorable certainty once set in motion by the right combination of courage and circumstance. "Will you continue serving?" Rodriguez asked as they prepared to leave the courtroom where so much had been revealed and resolved. Mitchell considered the question while watching the activity continuing across the base. Official vehicles still moving with purpose between buildings, as the reverberations from the morning's revelations continued to spread through the command structure. "Some missions can only be accomplished by people who officially don't exist," she answered. "Whether that describes my future depends entirely on tomorrow morning's conversation with Admiral Wells." As they walked through the corridors that had witnessed her public vindication, Mitchell reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from disgrace back to honor through the simple act of speaking two words that carried more power than anyone in that courtroom had realized. Shadow Phoenix had been more than a unit designation. It had been an identity, a commitment to principles that transcended official policy, when moral clarity demanded action that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. The next morning found Commander Sarah Mitchell standing before Admiral Wells' office at precisely 800, wearing her dress blues with restored confidence and carrying herself with the bearing of someone who had survived a crucible that would have destroyed lesser officers. The morning light streaming through the Admiral's windows seemed somehow brighter than it had during the dark days of her court-martial, as if the very atmosphere had changed along with her official status. "At ease, Commander," Wells said as Mitchell entered the spacious office that overlooked the harbor where ships continued their missions as they had every day throughout the drama that had consumed the previous week. "Please have a seat. We have much to discuss regarding your future service to your country." The leather portfolio from the previous day's proceedings lay open on Wells's desk, its contents representing possibilities that Mitchell was only beginning to understand. The vindication had been complete, but vindication was merely the first step in a larger process of restoration that would determine whether her unique skills and experience could be channeled toward new missions that required exactly her combination of moral courage and operational expertise. "Your record has been fully restored, Commander, including appropriate recognition for actions that can never be publicly acknowledged." Wells began studying Mitchell with the appraising gaze of someone evaluating a valuable but dangerous asset. "More importantly, certain parties in Washington have expressed interest in establishing new operational capabilities that would benefit from your particular background and demonstrated judgment under extreme pressure." Mitchell listened carefully to the carefully worded offer that was being extended, understanding that she was being given an opportunity to return to the shadows where she had always operated most effectively, but this time with full institutional support and proper oversight designed to prevent the kind of betrayal that had destroyed her previous team. The choice was entirely hers, but the implications extended far beyond personal rehabilitation to questions of how the military would handle future operations that required moral courage as much as tactical expertise. Some ghosts, she had learned, were called back to service for reasons that transcended personal redemption and entered the realm of institutional necessity, where the lessons learned from past failures could be applied to prevent future tragedies through the careful application of hard-won wisdom gained at enormous personal cost. If you're interested in learning more stories like Sarah's, where courage meets conviction in the most unlikely places, make sure to subscribe to One Human One Story, and hit that notification bell because next week we're diving into the incredible tale of a small-town teacher who discovered something that changed the course of American education forever. Leave a comment below telling us what you think Sarah's call sign meant to those who recognized it. And don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important truth. Until next time, remember that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about, and sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen in moments when no one is watching except the people whose lives depend on someone having the courage to do what's right rather than what's